As a fan of Mortal Shell's scaled down approach to the Souls-like back in 2020, I was very skeptical of Mortal Shell 2's enthusiasm for making everything about it larger. Bigger is not always better. But if you felt the same, then allow me to assuage those fears at the time. Besides being bigger, Mortal Shell is also better in almost every way. It still has rough edges, mostly weird technical things and some balance issues, especially towards the end of this 25 to 30 hour quest. But its world, the occasionally daunting act of exploring it, and the gritty skirmishes you'll have while doing so are all greatly improved. As you did in the first game, you will play as a creature whose shiny, sinewy body places it somewhere between a Ridley Scott monster and a corpse.
Arise, Harbinger.
One that can embody the forms of dead warriors of some renown and use their abilities to its ultimate ends. Like Illusion of Gaia, but with more thieves and war criminals. When you occupy one of these shells, you take on its identity and its abilities. When it's taken too much of a beating, this happens, and you're given a chance to fight back in. This was the Mortal Shell gimmick back then, and it's still a fun take on The Last Stand now. But the amount of possible people to climb in and pilot like a squishier Iron Man has doubled in the sequel, with only a couple of returning faces joining a mostly new roster of colorful scallywags. Standouts include this ferocious cannibal,
See, he's no holy man.
and this armor-clad alien.
Strange woman.
The range of options may seem strange out of context, but they fit perfectly in the macabre world Mortal Shell 2 creates. The overall story is a bit of a cryptic mess, but the side stories of these individual characters really grounded in human interactions that are relatable. The most important improvements to these shells from the previous game isn't how they look or what nonsense they got into before they died, but what makes them different outside of that stuff. Previously, differences between shells were tucked away in passive abilities you could spend points to unlock. These passive abilities return in much more abundance and in a better organized progression chart, but each shell now also has distinct active abilities that make them even more impactful in combat and diverse among each other. Now, TL can do stuff like this, while Aerodrim can wear out enemies with this. Landing some of these can be finicky, specifically the ones that require traveling some distance or auto-locking onto enemies, and I would just inexplicably miss with abilities like TL's Shadow Stab every once in a while. Regardless, this is a gratifying step up from the original, and made actively switching between shells to try new combat tricks a rewarding experience. That's all the easier since any points spent to enhance specific shells can be refunded and reallocated for free as many times as you want. I occasionally felt encouraged to do so in barely subtle ways. Have a tough enemy that leans heavily on fire-based attacks and burn status, max out Laszlo's fireproof armor. That said, this can have a hand in making later game bosses feel underpowered, as they don't scale in the same way you can if you dedicate to the grind, and validating their strengths while also overpowering them otherwise. The arsenal of weapons has ballooned in kind, with 8 main melee weapons and 8 ranged sidearms to mix and match, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Some are quick and great for stacking debuffs but don't do much damage and can't reliably interrupt enemies. Some have great range but take 3 to 5 business days to swing. I tended to lean towards weapons with really good range attacks, as I often started encounters with an all-in alpha strike, in hopes to put enemies down as quickly as possible and avoid the real danger most of them present. That was a little frustrating considering that, though largely mechanically sound, any actions involving clicking the sticks like running and auto-targeting were very finicky. Stamina is completely gone in Mortal Shell 2, so you are free to swing to your heart's content. Replacing it is Resolve, a meter filled by landing melee attacks and spent to do basically everything else, from shooting ranged weapons to shell abilities. I liked that it meant I had to stay aggressive in melee in order to reap the benefits of all the other cool stuff, and Resolve gain is steady enough without any modifications that I never felt like I was locked out of those options when I needed them. Mortal Shell 2 varies its defensive offerings in an interesting way too, treating a small number of different seals as shields with differing functionality. One of them allows you to harden, a signature feature that helped Mortal Shell stand out amongst its soul-like peers 5 years ago. Another introduces a pretty genre standard block, complete with a parry if you have the right timing. A third is a parry-only option, allowing you to execute enemies much faster at the risk of getting punished yourself. I stuck with hardening most of my run, but I did appreciate how this operated as sort of a de facto difficulty setting, with an option to switch it at will should you want to try your luck. The melee weapons are consistent and reliable, but largely mundane in comparison to the sidearm. This beast from the first game returns in all its glory, but is basic in comparison to some of the new options, like the haunted skeleton of a baby in a cage that radiates evil, or a magical loot that can confuse enemies. I found that these had more specific uses than the melee options. The crossbow was for picking off weak enemies on the fringes or stacking debuffs on an enemy, while the others I mentioned were more for starting fights with a bang. On top of that, tar stones that add additional stats and features to your game plan can be slotted into your weapons and shells. They come in all sorts, as simple as raising damage or crit rate passively, or adding the ability to infuse elemental properties to your attacks for limited periods of time. But some even go as far as adding new abilities to your arsenal, like a big sword spin or a bullet rain for area damage. Tar stones are fickle though. Many of them can only be attached to certain weapons, making the war tool you invest in more important. I found some of the most useful ones pretty early, and being cool and flashy aside, I went most of the campaign opting to spend my resolve elsewhere. The shell, weapon, and tar stones configurations felt endless. While I'm sure there's some min-maxing to be done, I found that I could make anything work in some capacity, which actually had the unexpected effect of pressing me to stay more within the lines when it came to gearing up. Each shell has a signature weapon, and though nothing about them changes in the intended hands, some of these pairings do feel uniquely matched. The minigun is slow to start up and leaves you stationary while you rain bullets down range, but Proxima's ability to mitigate incoming damage passively makes her the perfect person to fire it. Shells, weapons, and tar stones are all scattered through a dense and dangerous reimagining of Fallgrim. In the first game, a central hub sprawled into 3 directions, each path narrowing to a dungeon with a boss waiting eagerly at the end. Mortal Shell 2 takes this concept to its limit, with the central hub zone being a huge Pangea of twisted flora, bizarrely bleached mountains, and dilapidated kingdoms. You have to fight your way to the 6 gates lingering at the fringes of the land this time, each the threshold of their own dungeons with evil to cleanse on the other side. There are a dizzying amount of paths to get sidetracked down on your journey as well. Around every corner felt like another pair of corners to turn. Fallgrim is perfectly designed to engross you. Each angle reveals just enough of a thing on a horizon or a path fading into a dirt cave that you just have to know what's going on over there. There's a map this time around to help keep your bearings, but I do still wish it had a more robust pinning system or a node option, because you are so often forced to leave a point of interest behind to explore something else, and then something else, and then something else, and before you know it, you forgot about that first thing you meant to come back to. It also doesn't help to solve how confusing the world can be to navigate at first. Things start to look very samey until you get some significant travel time logged. It's better at landmarking locations with unique features than the first game was, at least. Of the many things you can expect to find out in the wild, like altars that produce small combat gauntlets for a prize, or gates that sling you across the map towards faraway lands, it's the many little dungeons littering the world that were always the most curious. Each one of the misty doorways reveals a self-contained mini-adventure. These bite-sized encounters are also in beacons, jagged spikes that jut through the soil like rotting teeth, that serve as your bonfire-style checkpoints. What you do in them isn't necessarily different, but when you walk down one's narrow corridors and out the door to reveal a cloudy night sky above, the strange nature of this world is most apparent in them. They weren't Breath of the Wild levels of clever, but they really broke up the main adventure well. I got pretty used to seeing these beacons because the monsters lurking around Fulgrim can be real nightmares. Almost any group of enemies can be lethal if you're not on your game. I can't tell you how many times I didn't take a lowly group seriously, missed an attack, and got jumped nearly to death as punishment. Foes come in many different forms, from surly ironclad knights and crazed cultists to exploding bats. Everything is more cursed than you first expect it to be. These are the weirdest bad guys I've seen in quite some time. It's also refreshing to see a game clearly inspired by Dark Souls so gleefully go above and beyond in creep factor. Bosses are the culmination of this inspired aesthetic. This Moth Knight and crazy Bog Witch in a fiery chariot of a wheelchair are among my favorite, even if they aren't always the most interesting combat scenarios in the game. Mortal Shell 2's expansion into a large-scale action RPG is mostly a successful one. It struggles with a few technical bits and doesn't completely fix some of the first game's nagging problems, like how confusing it can be to navigate its beautifully nightmarish world, or how you can outpace the endgame's challenges without much effort. But all of its new ideas are great ones, especially the new options like active shell abilities. Its more open world is seductive in how it can have you willingly jumping down rabbit hole after rabbit hole. Its expanded combat adds personality to the colorful cast of warriors whose bodies you'll borrow and abilities you'll steal. And it's all dipped in a remarkable dark fantasy setting, filled with some of the most striking monsters and memorable imagery in the genre. For more action, check out our reviews of The Relic First Guardian or Beast of Reincarnation. And for everything else, stick with IGN.